a PhD should be a really positive experience. So as PhD students, you get to take a really deep dive into a subject that you're interested in. You get to develop rare and valuable skills and expertise, and you get to work with and learn from really, really smart people. It can also open the door to a career in research where you get to pursue your own ideas and use your creativity to ultimately contribute something new to the world. And of course, you get to call yourself doctor at the end, which is pretty cool. So I believe that it should be an amazing experience and one that you look back on years from now with fondness. But this isn't everybody's experience. And a lot of students end up burned out and miserable. Now, there are all kinds of reasons why this might happen. But today, I'd like to focus on one particularly common problem that can negatively affect every aspect of your experience. Not only your ability to do your work, but also ultimately other aspects of your life as well. And that is imposter syndrome. So an imposter is basically someone who's pretending to be something that they're not. And imposter syndrome is the feeling that you're not good enough or that you don't belong there. And it usually also comes with comparison with other people, usually negative, so thinking that you're maybe not as good as the people around you, but not always. It can come with the worry about what other people will think about you, which is often actually not really about what other people think, but maybe what you think about yourself. And it also comes with the fear of being found out. So if you don't believe you're good enough, what if somebody finds out that you somehow kind of snuck your way in? At the same time, you might also have a certain image of how good you should be, or a certain expectation of yourself. So we have this combination of low confidence, but with very high self-expectations. Now, these beliefs, they might not be conscious, but they can kind of sit in the dark shadows of your mind, quietly influencing everything that you do. And it can influence your behavior and your decisions and your confidence in many different ways, but the general pattern is this. So if you see yourself as an imposter, so someone who doesn't deserve to be there, the natural tendency will be to hide. So when something goes wrong, or when you don't know how to do something, then you don't seek help. You don't want to ask a stupid question. So generally, you'll avoid talking to people, and you'll stay small and kind of try to be invisible. It can also mean that you don't fully invest yourself, or you undermine yourself in different ways. Because subconsciously, if you don't put your full effort in, then no one can really judge your full potential. And that might manifest itself through procrastination or perfectionism. And if things are going wrong, you might also take it as further evidence that you're not good enough. So it just reinforces that imposter feeling. But then, this doesn't just happen when things are going wrong. Even when things go right, if you feel like you're an imposter, you might think, well, I was lucky, or I don't deserve any praise, or it might mean that you don't want to show your work to other people in case it gets rejected if you're going for publications, or maybe it gets criticized, or if somebody discovers a problem. So imposter syndrome, if it's unchecked, becomes this kind of negative cycle where the more you work, the less confident you get, and the harder it gets to do the work, which just reinforces the self-doubt. So the question is, how do we reverse this cycle? So how can you approach the work in such a way that you get more confident over time, and so that you can face the problems that arise with energy and enthusiasm and take pride in your achievements? So there are two basic ways I would like to approach this. First of all, what I'd like to do is try and undo some of the false beliefs or assumptions that lead to imposter syndrome. And then I'd like to talk about how we can build confidence and skills so that you can become the best researcher that you can be. And hopefully also enjoy the process. So where does imposter syndrome come from? In my own case, it was there from the very first day of my PhD. So on that first day, way back in September 2003, so almost 21 years ago, which is a little bit scary, there was this induction event where all kinds of different people from the department came and spoke to all the new PhD students. And a lot of it was about administration and those kind of boring things. But there's one talk in particular that I still remember 21 years later. So the head of the department came and told us that we were the best of the best. And that was why we'd been chosen to do a PhD program at one of the top universities in the country. Now, this was supposed to be encouraging. It was supposed to give us the confidence and inspire us to do great things. But when he said that we were the best of the best, that little voice inside my head said, I'm not. So I was sure that the others probably were that good, but I actually hadn't done that well as an undergraduate, mostly because I didn't really apply myself that well, and I just did enough to get through. And part of the reason why I'd applied to do a PhD was to kind of make up for that poor performance as an undergraduate and kind of show what I was really capable of. So I started from day one kind of feeling like an imposter. So I'll come back to how to overcome these feelings later. But for now, let's just look at this assumption that as PhD students, you're supposed to be the best of the best. Now, in some ways, it does make sense. So if we imagine the education system as like a pyramid with compulsory education at the bottom of the pyramid and then a PhD at the very top, everybody who goes through that system gets continually assessed and graded and basically ranked. So the people who do very well have the option of moving on to the next level. Everybody else leaves, does something else. So by the time you get here, by the time you get to a PhD, you've probably done quite well at all those previous levels of the education system. But there is a problem with viewing a PhD this way, of seeing it as the kind of ultimate culmination of the education system. Because if we look at most of the education system, most of that pyramid, there is a certain consistency in the way that it's structured, where you have a standardized syllabus to follow that's been structured to help you learn. You have a clear timetable, so you know exactly where you need to be, what you need to do, and when. You don't really need to think about it. And then you have a standardized exam where everybody does the same test based on the syllabus, so you have these clear boundaries between what you're supposed to know and what you don't need to. You also have, another difference people often don't think about, is you have local competition where you're graded or ranked relative to your peers, to the other people in the room. But in a PhD, there is no syllabus. So you have to design your own project and decide what to read, for example. There is also no set timetable. So you have to manage your own time and manage your priorities. There is no standardized exam. So you have to defend your own personal work in front of an expert panel, and you have no idea what they might ask. And you also have global competition, where you have to somehow make a novel contribution, which is contributing something relative to the literature that's already been published by the researchers around the world. So a PhD is not just different to everything that you've done before. In many respects, it's the complete opposite. And that means that the skills that got you here, the skills that got you into a PhD, are not the same skills that will help you to complete one. And for many PhD students who've done exceptionally well throughout all those previous levels of the education system, the PhD might just be the first time that they've struggled academically. And if you've consistently been told from a very young age by teachers or parents or others, implicitly or explicitly, that your value is in some way tied to your academic ability or achievement, then suddenly struggling academically can feel like a threat to your very sense of self-worth. And imposter syndrome might not just be the belief that you aren't good enough to do a PhD, but the belief that you aren't good enough. So let's rethink this. So instead of seeing a PhD as the culmination or the ultimate achievement in the education system, I think it's better to think of it as the bottom level, the entry level of the professional academic system. And what this means is that you're not the best of the best. You're a beginner. And you're not expected to know everything, and there's going to be huge gaps in your knowledge, inevitably. And even when you finish your PhD, you're still a beginner relative to somebody who's been working in the field for years or decades. So the goal of a PhD is not to prove how good you are, but to learn and to develop the skills and the knowledge of a professional academic researcher. So then the question is, how do we go about this? So in the absence of a clear syllabus or roadmap to follow, how can you structure your own work and set your priorities to best develop your skills? So the first, most important, most fundamental point is to embrace what you don't know. So as academics, the whole point is to kind of dance on the edge of ignorance and to step into the unknown with curiosity. So if you're open about what you don't know, then nobody can find you out. And instead of comparing yourself to other people, you can learn from them. So talk to people and ask the stupid questions, not only about things that you need to know for your own project, but also ask people about their work, because most people quite like it when you show an interest in what they do. And it will also broaden your knowledge and teach you things that you never would have learned otherwise. So just a quick note here. Since you're at this conference and many of you have come from other departments or other places, whenever you go to these kind of conferences or summer schools, the talks aren't actually, in most cases, the most important thing, because in all honesty, most of you probably won't remember most of what you hear. The real benefit a lot of the time lies in meeting and talking to other researchers and making connections. But what often happens is people will stick with their own little groups, or maybe they'll meet one or two people and just talk to those people. So as a challenge to you, whenever you're at these events, try and introduce yourself to, let's say, at least 3 new people and connect with them, exchange emails, connect on LinkedIn. Because networking is actually one of the most important skills that you can have for developing an academic career. So if in one of the coffee breaks you see someone who's on their own, just go up and talk to them. Introduce yourself, because everyone will be kind of waiting for somebody to sort of open that door. You know, they'll be pretending to be on their phones, but actually it's like, please, someone come and talk to me. So most people like it, so introduce yourself. So I'll challenge you over this week, 3 new people a day, and then if you get into that habit, it's going to serve you well in your careers. But to come back to the point about learning from others and asking questions, at this point, the voice of imposter syndrome might start whispering in the background and worrying about how people might judge you if you ask the wrong question. But if somebody reacts negatively, if they're rude or judgmental or dismissive, it's not about you. They're revealing something about themselves, most likely stemming from their own insecurity, in which case you just move on and talk to somebody else. Okay. So the second point is that if you want to get good at what you do, it's not enough to just set ambitious goals and work hard. So the way that you work and the way that you structure your goals makes all the difference in the world. So let's say that your current level of skill is here and you want to get to here. Now, if you set your immediate goals far in excess of your current level of skill, it doesn't matter how hard you try, it doesn't matter how hard you work, you'll just be frustrated. So what we need to do is have the confidence to set ambitious long-term goals, but also have the patience and the humility to then work on gradually developing the skills required, recognizing that it takes a little bit of time. So if this gap is too big, what we want to do is simplify and set our immediate goals somewhere around here, somewhere at or just a little bit beyond our current ability. And when we operate in this zone, because we're pushing at the limit of what we can do, the work requires our full attention. And this means we need to narrow our focus and shut out other distractions. And also, because we're pushing at the limit of what we can do, it might take some time and it might take several attempts or experimentation with different approaches. And this means that we need to be willing to stay with it beyond any initial discomfort or frustration and keep trying. And although it might be slow and frustrating, this is where your skills develop. So as an academic, this is where you need to be kind of the most curious, the most engaged, the most enthusiastic, and most energized. And then when it finally clicks and you figure it out, you solve whatever the problem is, not only does it feel good, but then repeating the same kind of task gets easier and faster and requires a lot less brain power. So one of the best examples of this is in computer game design. And this is why so many games have levels of increasing difficulty. So instead of starting with the most difficult level, which would just lead to frustration, they start very easy, and then each level pushes you a little bit beyond what you can do. But by working through the frustration, you can figure it out. And then once you've done it once, repeating the same level gets much, much easier. And one of the reasons why games can be so addictive is this cycle of challenge and success and reward. So if it's too easy and there's no challenge whatsoever, then it's boring. But if it's too difficult and the feeling of success is too infrequent, then it's just frustrating. And both cases tend to lead to disengagement. Now, in a PhD, the imposter voice might then say that you're not motivated enough, or that you're lazy, but maybe it's just because you're trying to do too much too fast. So here's a quick recap of those. So number one is to be humble, acknowledge that you're a beginner and embrace what you don't know. And then to simplify or start small. So set the task just beyond your current level so that it's achievable with effort. And then slow down and try and give it your full care and attention, and then stay with it beyond the initial discomfort and try different approaches if necessary. And from there, we can gradually start to add complexity. So while it might seem slow at first, if you work in this way, then you'll quickly overtake the people who just rush and overwhelm themselves and set the targets far in excess of what they can actually do. So using these principles will take you a long way, but there's one more principle that separates the people who are just very good at what they do from the very best. So when we think about skill development, whether we're talking about the structure of computer games or about education, we tend to think about a progressive increase in difficulty or complexity over time. Now that's not wrong, but it's incomplete. So if you want to be really, really, really good at what you do, you also need to cycle back over the basics and re-examine things you already know or skills that you already have. To give an analogy, Let's say you start weightlifting in the gym. So gradually you can add more weight and you can get stronger. And this will work for a while, but at some point, you'll reach a limit where you just can't add any more weight. Now, the imposter voice might then say that you've reached the limit of your potential and then get frustrated and demotivated. But it's more likely that there's some problem with your basic technique or the way that you're training. So then, slowing down and paying attention to the basics, to the things that you learned early and then stopped thinking about, might then unlock greater potential. So bringing this back to academia, when you took exams earlier in your education, if you scored, say, 80% on every single exam, you would be near the top of every single class. But it would also mean that 20% of the material you don't know. So then you move on to the next class or the next module, which maybe builds on that material without reviewing it. And this means that you might be building on a slightly weakened foundation. Now, it's probably not a problem at first, but it might limit what you can do much, much later. So in my undergraduate physics course, we had to do a few maths courses in the first year. And looking back now, I honestly think that every single student on that course should have kept taking those basic fundamental maths courses until they could score 100% every single time. Until those basic skills were absolutely ingrained because they served as the foundation for everything else. So the very best in the field aren't the best because of the fancy, impressive, advanced things that they can do. They are the best because of absolute mastery of the basics. A great example of this was Richard Feynman, who's widely considered one of the best physicists of all time. So he's known for all kinds of contributions to different areas of physics, but the reason why he was able to do this was that he kept going back to the basics. He kept going back to the fundamentals, even trying to rederive the basic principles of algebra just for fun. He's also a great example of curiosity in the face of the unknown. So there's one story that he told where he was trying to put together a lecture to explain some aspect of, I think, quantum mechanics in simple terms. And he came back excited because he couldn't do it, because that meant that he didn't understand it. So if you can approach your work with that attitude, being constantly interested in the basics and the fundamentals, and then being excited by the things that you don't know, it'll take you a long way. So how do we apply all of this practically to the PhD? So let's start with working with academic literature, because that's one of the areas where people tend to struggle the most. So the way many PhD students will approach this is to treat it like reading for an undergraduate exam, where the basic aim is to learn as much as possible of the syllabus and then show how much you know. Now, this makes sense if that's how you've approached everything that you've done before. But unlike an undergraduate course, where information is carefully selected and structured to help you learn, the academic literature, well, first of all, assumes an expert level and isn't written to teach. Much of it is badly written, much of it is contradictory, and much of it is wrong because it's working on the edge of knowledge rather than dealing with kind of well-established knowledge. There is also no specific order to it, and there are no clear boundaries between what you need to know and what you don't. Also, the mass of the literature tends to grow exponentially as you chase references, and the more you read, the more references you discover. So when faced with this big tangled mess of contradictory information, it's not surprising if it's a bit overwhelming. And because there is so much, the natural temptation may be to try to read more, read faster, and to take better notes, but this will lead to overwhelm. Because if you don't understand the papers that you're reading, so if the gap between your immediate goals and your current level of skill is too big, going faster is only going to lead to frustration and amplify that imposter voice inside your head. So instead of trying to read everything as quickly as possible and trying to show how much we know, what if we did the opposite and instead we slowed down and simplified and just read one paper? Then the question would become, if we just read one paper, what should we read? So one of the most important principles or things to understand when you're working with the academic literature is that not all papers are of equal value, either to you or to the field more generally. And most individual papers have little to no impact on the field, little to no influence. But then there will be a few, very few, that have a massively disproportionate impact on the field. So they're the ones that make some breakthrough discovery or propose some radical new idea or radical new technique that changes the direction of the field. So a good place to start is to take one of these groundbreaking, influential papers and take the time to really understand what they did or what's the central idea, how it differed to what came before or what problem existed before that they solved, and then what influence that had on the field. But even when we simplify and we just try to do this for one paper, it might be quite difficult. So it might take several readings, and because these papers are not written to teach, you might also need to refer to other sources to try and understand it. But the advantage of focusing on these groundbreaking papers is that other people will have then written about them. So you can refer to textbooks, review articles, or even Wikipedia pages or YouTube videos. Or, of course, you can ask somebody, or perhaps you can ask ChatGPT. Now, I have my thoughts about AI, and I think you need to be very, very careful with it and never ever use it to write content for you. But for explaining some well-established concepts, it can be a pretty good starting point. So once you've taken the time to do this and you've absorbed some of this basic understanding from just a few of these groundbreaking papers, you'll have a pretty good foundation for understanding much of the incremental work that followed. Now, the incremental papers, they are important, but they're important collectively as they slowly fill the gaps between the big landmark papers. So you need to know about this incremental research, but you don't have to read everything, and you don't need to get lost in all of the details to get an initial general sense of what's happening. So if you take a sample of, say, 10 recent papers on any given topic, and you read the introductions, you'll probably notice that they say quite similar things about the ongoing challenges in the field, the trends and the debates that are going on, and the kinds of research that are being conducted around that particular topic. They'll also use many of the same techniques, and they'll cite many of the same key papers and refer to many of the same key concepts. So quite quickly, we can get an idea of the context and the common ideas, and we can build a kind of initial low-resolution picture of what's happening in the field. And then beyond this foundational knowledge, you will of course have to get into the details of some individual papers, but this needs to be laser focused on specific issues. So for example, parts of my own research involved fabrication of a particular type of optical probe. And of all of the papers on this specific topic, there were two that then served as the basis for what I did. And I went back to these papers many, many times throughout the course of my research. So if you approach the literature in this way, focusing first on landmark papers, then getting a general sense of what's happening in the field, and then specific understanding of some very, very relevant papers, then you can start to read things much, much faster, having built that foundational skill. So there's obviously a lot more to a PhD than just reading them. You also need to develop practical skills. And once again, the imposter voice can undermine this, either by stopping you from taking action and perhaps telling you that you need to spend more time planning or reading, or making you overcompensate by being too ambitious and doing too much. So whatever techniques you plan to use, you need to get some practical experience before you can expect to get good results. I would also argue that you need a bit of practical experience before you can effectively plan a lot of your research, because it's only through experience that you really understand what's possible and what's required for any given technique. And I would argue that it's only through getting some practical experience of research techniques that you can really understand much of the literature and appreciate the difference between good research and bad. So what I'd suggest, especially if you're at an early stage of your PhD, is to start getting practical experience as early as possible to give yourself the opportunity to make mistakes. And this is one of the most important shifts in mindset as you move from undergraduate study to postgraduate research. So whereas mistakes are penalized and permanently recorded in your grades at undergraduate level, they are an inevitable and also necessary part of research at postgraduate level and beyond. But the good part is that it doesn't really matter how many attempts it takes to get something right. And in fact, it might make you a much better researcher if you adapt and learn from each iteration. So instead of starting with very, very high expectations, what I would say is initially to forget about results. So be humble and be patient and just focus initially on figuring out the basic component parts of the technique that you need, and then gradually you can level up and add complexity. But no matter how good you get at your research techniques, things will still go wrong and you'll still make mistakes. Now, this might sound pessimistic, but it's just the nature of research. So success in academic research isn't about making sure that everything goes perfectly to plan. It's about how you react when it doesn't. So what a lot of people with imposter syndrome will do is disengage from the problem in front of them, either through procrastination or by multitasking and then switching their focus to something else. And this is an approach that guarantees that they stay busy, but without solving any of the issues that arise. So when we face a problem and don't know what to do, it, again, might take some time. It might require several attempts or experimentation with different approaches. And this means, again, that we've got to be willing to stay with it, stay with the problem, beyond any initial discomfort or frustration, and keep trying. And although it might be slow and frustrating, this is not only where your skills develop, but also where discovery happens. So as an academic, this is where you need to be your most curious, most engaged, most enthusiastic, most energized. So when you face a problem, try to slow down and focus all of your attention on it, perhaps by simplifying and breaking it down into smaller, easier problems and tackling them one at a time. And then even if you break it down into small problems, again, it might take several attempts to get it right, but then it feels really good when you do. And this ultimately helps to reinforce your motivation and your confidence as you engage with the next problem. And speaking of confidence, and I'll finish on this and then we can get into the Q&A. So at undergraduate level, or throughout most of the education system, the relationship between effort and success is quite clear. It's quite predictable. So if you show up and you do what you're asked to do and you learn what you're told to learn, you can be quite confident in the outcome. But in academic research, no matter how much skill or knowledge we develop, we can never really know what problems are going to arise, and we can never really know what the result will be. And even if you do everything right, or even if you approach everything the way that I've described, some things might go wrong in ways that you just can't control. So confidence cannot come from a place of certainty in the outcome. Also, no matter how much you learn, there will always be more that you don't know. And that journey will never end, so we can't base confidence on the idea that we know enough. So, true confidence, I think, comes instead from a belief in your ability to cope with whatever happens. So, the belief that even if the PhD goes completely wrong, that you'll be okay. You'll figure it out. And it comes also from the belief that you don't need a PhD to prove that you're enough, because you already are. And if you approach it with that belief and that inner confidence, you'll be all right. Thank you. Thank you.